February 1258. A scribe is still at work in the great library district of Baghdad when the Mongol army breaches the city's outer walls. We do not know his name. We know what he was copying. Astronomical tables, most likely, or a medical treatise, because the copying houses of Baghdad never closed willingly. What happened next took less than a week. The libraries that had taken 5 centuries to build were gone. House of Wisdom, the institution that had translated Aristotle, invented algebra, and mapped the known stars, did not survive. Tigris ran dark with ink from the books thrown into it. Also, the chroniclers wrote, and for once the chroniclers may not have been exaggerating. Now, go back 500 years to a flat plain between 2 rivers, to a caliph standing in the dark with small fires of burning naphtha, tracing the outline of a city that does not yet exist. This is where it begins. A city built in a perfect circle. From above, if you could have seen it from above, it would have looked like a drawing of an idea. 4 gates facing the 4 directions, great mosque at the heart, the caliph's palace rising above everything, its green dome visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. The Tigris moves slowly past the eastern bank, wide and brown, heavy with the silt of distant mountains. The air smells of bread from the market bakeries, of ink from the copying houses, of horses and leather, and the particular dry heat that settles over the plain before the afternoon wind arrives. The city is loud with argument. That is how you know it is alive. The year is 762. Caliph al-Mansur stands on a flat plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and makes a decision that will define the next 5 centuries of human civilization. He has already rejected a dozen sites. He has consulted astronomers, engineers, and diviners. He has, by the accounts of his own court historians, spent a night lying on the ground of this particular patch of earth, watching the stars, deciding whether the omens favored what he was about to attempt. He is building a city from nothing, and not merely a city, a statement. The Abbasid Caliphate has just displaced the Umayyads, shifted the empire's center of gravity eastward from Damascus toward Persia, and al-Mansur intends the new capital to embody that shift in brick and mortar and geometry. The city will be called Madinat al-Salam, City of Peace. It will be perfectly circular, roughly 2 kilometers in diameter, 4 axial roads meeting at a central plaza. The Caliph walked the perimeter himself, according to the historian al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, placing small fires of cotton soaked in naphtha to trace the outer wall's arc in the darkness, so he could see the shape of the thing before it existed. 100,000 workers built it in 4 years. The outer walls rose to nearly 30 meters. Between the outer and inner walls ran a ring of residential and administrative buildings. At the center, the Grand Mosque and the palace, its famous green dome visible from every road approaching the city. What archaeology has confirmed, excavations in the Kark district of modern Baghdad consistently uncover Abbasid period ceramics and foundation traces at depths consistent with 8th century construction, is that the city's weight shifted almost immediately eastward across the Tigris. As the population outgrew the plan, al-Mansur had built something too small for what it was about to become. The circle was perfect. The city inside it had already decided to grow beyond it. The year is 830. Caliph al-Mamun has inherited an empire and a problem. The problem is knowledge, specifically the knowledge stored in Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Syriac manuscripts that his librarians keep acquiring, and that almost no one in Baghdad can read. His solution is an institution that has no real precedent in the medieval world. Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. It was not a single building, but a complex, a library, a translation bureau, an observatory, and what we would now recognize as a research institute, all operating under one patronage. Al-Mamun recruited scholars the way a later age would recruit armies, with money, prestige, and the promise that their work would matter. A Christian physician named Hunayn ibn Ishaq became the institution's most prolific translator, rendering over 100 Greek medical and philosophical texts into Arabic. including nearly all of Galen and much of Aristotle, with a precision that later scholars have described as extraordinary even by modern standards. He was paid, according to contemporary accounts, in gold measured against the weight of his manuscripts. What the House of Wisdom produced was not merely translation, it was synthesis. Scholars from Persia, India, Greece, and the Byzantine world sat in the same rooms and argued with each other's ideas. The mathematician Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra here. The word itself comes from the title of his book, Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr, and introduced the Hindu-Arabic numeral system to the Islamic world in a form that would eventually reach Europe and displace Roman numerals entirely. His name, Latinized, gave us the word algorithm. The physical remains of the House of Wisdom have not been definitively located, but 9th century sources place it near the eastern bank of the Tigris, in the neighborhood that grew up around the Caliph's new eastern palace. The building may be lost. The mathematics it produced is still running the world. Step into the Kark market district of 9th century Baghdad on a Thursday morning, and the first thing you notice is the noise. Not the noise of a bazaar, which you might expect, the noise of disagreement. Booksellers argue with customers over the authenticity of manuscripts. A Greek-speaking physician debates diagnosis with a Persian herbalist outside a pharmacy stall. The smell of paper, real paper made in the mills that Baghdad had established after the Battle of Talas, brought paper-making knowledge from Central Asia, mixes with the scent of saffron from a spice merchant 3 stalls down, past a public fountain, a hammam already busy before midday, a school where boys recite mathematics aloud. The bread here is baked with sesame. Coffee, this is centuries before coffee reaches Baghdad, is absent, but something else fills its place. Sherbet, chilled with ice brought from the mountains, sold in small earthenware cups for a coin. By the mid-9th century, Baghdad's population has reached somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million souls. The estimates vary. Every contemporary account agrees on the essential fact. This is the largest city west of Tang, China. The physical city has long since overflowed its original circular plan. A second city has grown on the east bank of the Tigris, called Rusafa, with its own markets, mosques, hospitals, and residential quarters. 2 halves are connected by boat bridges, pontoons lashed together wide enough for carts. A Persian traveller named Ibn Hawqal, writing in the 970s, described arriving at the western bank and being unable to see the eastern shore clearly through the density of masts and hulls. The wealth that drives this is not primarily conquest. The great campaigns are a century old, but trade. Baghdad sits at the junction of overland and river routes connecting the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, the Silk Road to the Indian Ocean. Merchants from Basra arrive with goods from India. Merchants from Mosul bring Armenian copper. Jewish trading community, well documented in the Cairo Janaza papers, maintains commercial networks stretching from Baghdad to Cairo to the Iberian Peninsula. The city's economy is, by the standards of its age, genuinely global. Boats kept coming. The city kept growing. No one thought to ask when it would stop. The year is 833. Caliph al-Ma'mun dies on campaign near the Byzantine frontier, and the succession he leaves behind is contested in ways that will permanently alter the nature of Abbasid power. His brother Al-Mu'tasim takes the throne, but Al-Mu'tasim brings with him something new, a standing army of Turkish soldiers, purchased as slaves and trained as an elite military caste. They are called Ghulam. They are extraordinarily effective fighters. They are also, within a generation, the real power in the caliphate. A caliph named Al-Mutawakkil discovered the limits of this arrangement in 861 when his own Turkish commanders arranged his removal from power permanently. He did not survive the transition. What followed was a period historians call the Anarchy at Samarra, 40 years in which Turkish military commanders elevated and deposed caliphs at their own discretion, while the nominal rulers of the largest empire in the world exercised less actual authority than a moderately successful provincial governor. The caliphate moved temporarily to Samarra, a new city built expressly to house the Turkish troops away from Baghdad's civilian population, whose resentment had grown dangerous. The ruins of Samarra's great spiral minaret, the Malwiya, still stand today. 90 meters of wind-worn brick visible for miles across the Iraqi plain, the most complete remnant of this strange, hollow era. Baghdad remained the cultural and commercial center even during the political disruption. The scholars kept working, merchants kept trading. A poet named al-Mutanabbi, who would become the most celebrated Arabic language poet of the medieval period, was born in Kufa in 915 and spent his career navigating the fractured courts of the weakened caliphate, writing verses of such compressed precision that Arab literary scholars still argue over individual lines. His work is memorized by school children across the Arab world today. The caliph lost his power. The city refused to notice. The year is 945. A Persian dynasty called the Buyids has marched into Baghdad and taken effective control of the caliphate, reducing the Abbasid caliph to a ceremonial figure, spiritual head of Sunni Islam, permitted to exist as a legitimizing symbol, but stripped of military and administrative power. It is, by any conventional measure, a humiliation. What it is not is the end of Baghdad. The Buyid amirs were Shia Muslims governing a Sunni institution, which required a degree of political delicacy that expressed itself in patronage. They funded scholars, poets, and scientists with the enthusiasm of rulers who needed cultural prestige to compensate for contested religious legitimacy. A physician and philosopher named Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, developed significant portions of his medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, drawing on the accumulated scholarship of the House of Wisdom tradition. The Canon would become the standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and European universities for the next 600 years. A copy of a 12th century Latin translation survives in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. The physical city of Baghdad in the Buyid period shows, in its archaeological layers, the signs of a place that is contracting but not collapsing. The western round city has declined significantly. The great circular plan is no longer maintained as a unified administrative space, but the eastern bank, Rusafa, continues to grow and densify. The great booksellers' market, the Souk al-Warakin, remains one of the most active in the Islamic world. The books are still being copied, the arguments are still being made. The caliph was a symbol, the city was still real. The year is 1055. A Seljuk Turkish general named Tugrul Beg enters Baghdad, displaces the Buyids, and presents himself to the Abbasid caliph as a liberator, a Sunni Muslim rescuing the caliphate from Shia Persian domination. The caliph, Al-Qaim, receives him and grants him the title Sultan. It is the first time that title has been formally used for a temporal ruler in the Islamic world. What follows is, paradoxically, partial revival. Seljuks, unlike the Buyids, genuinely saw themselves as defenders of Sunni orthodoxy, and they expressed this through an institution that would reshape Islamic education for centuries, the madrasa. Seljuk vizier named Nizam al-Mulk established the Nizamiya Madrasa in Baghdad in 1067, endowing it with lands and salaries and making it the model for a network of institutions that spread across the Islamic world. Its physical location has been identified by archaeologists near the eastern bank of the Tigris. The building itself is long gone, but the institution's administrative records preserved in later chronicles describe a curriculum, a library, and a student body that drew scholars from across the Islamic world. One of those scholars was a man named Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who arrived at the Nizamiya in 1091 as its director and promptly experienced what he described as a crisis of certainty, a philosopher's equivalent of vertigo, in which he found himself unable to trust any of the epistemological foundations he had been trained on. He spent 4 years in withdrawal, wandering, writing. What he produced when he returned, the incoherence of the philosophers, followed by the revival of the religious sciences, reoriented the relationship between Islamic philosophy and Islamic theology in ways that scholars are still tracing. He died in 1111 in the city of Tus, having spent his final years near his birthplace. But the crisis that made him happened in Baghdad. The city had always been a place where certainty came to be questioned. Baghdad in the winter of 1257 is a city that has grown old with its anxieties. The Mongol Empire, which has already consumed Persia and Central Asia, has sent emissaries demanding submission. The Caliph al-Mustasim has received them and, for reasons that his own court could not fully explain, refused. He is not a military man. His advisors are divided. His army is smaller than it was a century ago and poorly coordinated. In the markets, people are still trading. The booksellers are still open. The scribe in the Souk al-Warakin is copying a treatise on astronomy because the work does not stop simply because something terrible is approaching. He does not know, on this particular morning, that he has perhaps 8 weeks left. The year is 1258. Hulagu Khan's army reaches the outskirts of Baghdad in January. The city's defenses, which were never designed to withstand a Mongol siege, hold for less than 2 weeks. On the 13th of February, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim surrendered. He did not survive the surrender. What followed lasted several days and left Baghdad's population at a fraction of what it had been. Chronicles give figures that range so widely as to be individually unreliable. The archaeology does not lie. The occupation layers above the 1258 stratum in excavations across Baghdad show a dramatic contraction of urban activity, a thinning of ceramics, silence in the record that speaks more clearly than any number. The House of Wisdom, or what remained of it, since the institution had been fragmenting for decades, was among the structures that did not survive. The books, street by street, library by library, the canals that had irrigated the surrounding farmland for 1,000 years were damaged and not repaired, and the agricultural hinterland that fed the city contracted with them, a landscape not of ash but of absence. Then a long, slow silence. The Caliph was gone. Caliphate was gone, and the world had to learn, slowly, to think without Baghdad. Baghdad still exists. It is one of the oldest continuously inhabited urban sites in the world, and it has been rebuilt many times, under many rulers, since the February of 1258. The modern city sits on the same plain, draws from the same rivers, bears the same name, but the Baghdad of Al-Mansur and Al-Mamun, of Hunayn ibn Ishaq and Al-Khwarizmi and Al-Ghazali, that city exists now only in what it left behind. The algebra that runs every computer algorithm, the medical knowledge that flowed through Avicenna into European universities and did not stop, star catalogues compiled in its observatory, which navigators used for centuries after the observatory itself, dust. The very numerals you use to read the dates in this video, there is a particular kind of loss that is not felt immediately. It is felt in the generations after, when people reach for a book that is not there, or ask a question that the burned library would have answered, or try to rebuild an institution whose original design no one can quite remember. The House of Wisdom was not replaced. The Abbasid Caliphate was not replaced. What the world lost in 1258, it rebuilt differently. In Cairo, in Timbuktu, in the Ottoman courts, in the libraries of Andalusia, piece by piece over centuries in forms the original scholars would not have recognized. The Tigris still moves slowly past the city's eastern edge, wide and brown, carrying the silt of distant mountains. In that, at least, nothing has changed. If Baghdad's story stays with you, there is more in this series worth your time. Every city we cover asks a version of the same question. What happens to the world when a center of civilization disappears? And who inherits what it knew? The answer is never simple, and it is never finished. If a particular moment in this video surprised you, the comments section is the right place for it. Those conversations are always the best part, and if you want to be there for the next city, the subscribe button is below.